So I kind of gave up being out there and trying to record out there. Just wasn't happening for me. So I've moved inside my room. As I said, first chance I've had to record stuff for a couple of weeks. So here is this week's rant. Now, before I start, one of the things I just want to sort of cover off here is the awful events that have happened in the UK concerning a presenter called Caroline Flack, who unfortunately took her own life. And she took her own life because of what was going on around her in terms of she was being prosecuted by the Crown Prosecution Service. And she kind of just decided that she was going to give up at that point and decided to end it all. I'm not going to jump into the whys or wherefores, but I'm going to refer back to a rant I did a couple of weeks ago about mental health, and just saying that if you recognise somebody in your circle of friends who's having problems, be there for them. That's all I'm going to say. So this week's rant is called Balanced or Unbalanced. And basically, at some point on your journey, you're going to have to make the decisions on whether you're going to run balanced connections or unbalanced connections. First thing people will say to me is, what the hell is the difference between a balanced connection or an unbalanced connection? And it's an interesting question that you need to ask yourself with the vintage synths, and quite often involved in the same sort of set of questions that you're going to need to answer yourself is the conversation about whether you need DI boxes or not. Look at that. Grown up a language. I'm talking about unbalanced, unbalanced connections and direct injection boxes. Now, for most people who are running small home studios, some of this stuff is completely irrelevant. But for other people, it's very critical. So let's start with an unbalanced connection, and hopefully up here somewhere should be a typical picture of an unbalanced connector. An unbalanced connector could really be described as a traditional connector, in the sense that it has two connections on it. One of those connectors will be described as literally as a hot or signal, and the second connector will be described as a shield or ground. Okay, the hot connector carries the instrument signal from the instrument to a desk or other target, whereas the ground provides an earth between the source and target. And the idea is that the ground is wrapped around the hot wire and creates some sort of Faraday cage, which is trying to shield out any electromagnetic interference in the place where that wire is running. So the whole idea is to try and sort of stop the interference on that hot wire. Now, most legacy synths, definitely, let's say I would say probably most synthesizers pre-2000 would have had an unbalanced connector. Okay, very few instruments prior to that would have balanced connectors. Now, if you look at some of the newer stuff, like my Jupiter 80, my Kronos, and my Oasis, they all have balanced connectors on them. But prior to that, they didn't have balanced connectors. They would have been of the unbalanced. So they would have been quarter-inch jacks, unbalanced. You either had a mono jack, depending on the age of the synthesizer, or you had two quarter-inch jacks, one for the left and one for the right. Now, at first glance, and there should be another picture appearing here, a balanced cable looks very much like an unbalanced cable. But it's the terminations at the end, up there, that should give you the clue whether that cable is capable of being run balanced or unbalanced. Now, a balanced connection typically either has a quarter-inch TRS style connection, which has 3 connection zones on it. There will be one connection zone, which will be the tip, and then next to the molded component should be something called the sleeve, and the bit between the tip and the sleeve is called the ring. Okay, 3 connection zones. If you haven't worked it out, when you're talking about connectors, especially if you look at the where you're ordering parts from, they will talk about TS connectors and TRS connectors. There's nothing sinister in that. A TS connector just means tip sleeve, as in no ring, and a TRS connector means tip ring sleeve, which is for a balanced. So effectively 3 zones against 2 zones. That's all they mean. Balanced connectors also come in typically XLR connectors. So again, a 3-pin arrangement on an XLR configuration. In both situations, both those connectors have 3 wires. One of those wires will be known as hot, one of those wires will be known as cold, and one of those wires will be known as shield or ground. And the shield or the ground is typically some sort of braid that is wrapped around the other 2 connectors. And in a good cable, there's another isolator between the 2 cables in the middle and the grounding cable that's running around the outside. Now, I'm not going to get into the technicalities of a balanced signal and how it really works in detail. I'm just going to give you the basics. So an unbalanced cable, as I said, has 2 wires in it. Okay, and with a bit of luck, there should be a graph appearing up here somewhere that shows that. Those 2 wires, one will be the ground and the other one will be a signal, and that signal will be what's transmitting from your instrument to your target, which typically is going to be some sort of mixing desk. That single cable is the one that carries the signal. If there is electromagnetic interference, as in something that gets through the braided shield, so if something is strong enough it will get through, it effectively puts some sort of additional signal onto that signal cable that will be picked up by your mixing desk and that will be amplified. So if you have a bad electromagnetic environment, you are going to get a very distorted signal at your mixing desk and you amplify that distortion, and there's very little you can do to take it out. A balanced cable, on the other hand, has 2 wires that carry the audio or the signal. One of those wires will carry the signal in what we call a positive environment, that's the hot, and the other one carries the signal in what we call a negative environment, that's the cold. The difference between the hot and the cold is the signal is inverted, so effectively the instrument creates 2 copies of the signal, what we call 180 degrees opposed. So when one has a peak, the other one has a trough. Okay, that's how it works, and they work 180 degrees opposed, so they're doing that all the time. And there should be a graph up here that I'll get myself confused, but it's that way. It's up here. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, where the cleverness is that a balanced cable will still be subject to the same electromagnetic interference, but the interference happens on both the hot and the cold cable. Okay, so and it happens in the same way on both cables. Okay, so whereas the signal is inverted, the interference will not be inverted. So the interference effectively is happening in the same way on both cables. This is where the cleverness happens, because at the target, when the signal is converted back into a single signal, because the hot and the cold are duplicates but just 180 degrees opposed, when at the target it recomposes the signal, the noise, because it's not 180 degrees opposed, drops off the signal. That's the cleverness. I'm not going to get into the whys or wherefore, but that's how it works. Okay, so you get a much cleaner signal and the noise is eliminated, and therefore you're not amplifying the noise and you're not getting distortion. That's basically a really quick overview of the difference between a balanced and an unbalanced cable connection. So, should you be using a balanced or unbalanced connector? Well, the answer is you should always use balanced, of course. Not necessarily. Using balanced cables comes at a cost. Typically the cables are more expensive, and there are certain circumstances where you might choose one over the other. So what we need to do is look at your setup. If you're in a location that has little or no electromagnetic interference, so it could be a home studio, you're not close to any big industrial motors, you've smoothed the power supply into the arena, there's no big transformers there to put noise onto the signals, possibly you can get away with an unbalanced environment. If the distances between your source and your target are less than 10 meters, actually the industry says about 15 10 feet, not 10 meters, about 3 meters, or the industry says about 15 feet, 4 meters at the outside, you probably would see little benefit using a balanced setup unless you had a lot of electromagnetic interference in that area. Actually, when I said the industry says 15 to 20 feet, if I'm brutally honest, or 4 to 6 meters. But I always feel that's a little too long. That's just me. If you see electromagnetic interference, as in you're getting lots of noise on your signal, or you're using longer runs either on a stage, then balanced cables would definitely benefit your environment. So now we come on to plugging my unbalanced instrument to a balanced environment. So you have to use a balanced set of cables to run signal because of the environment you're in. You've got legacy tech that doesn't support balanced signal production. How do you do it? This is where typically a DI or direct injection device comes into play. In actual fact, there are a number of reasons why you might put a DI box in, preventing ground loops. So the mixer and the target and the source are on different ground loops, and that can cause problems. You effectively earthing back through the environment's earth rather than actually being connected together. Boosting levels to your desk or interface, so the line level that comes off your instrument is not as high as you really require, and you can use a DI box for dealing with that. Protecting keyboards from phantom power on the target, so a lot of mixers are able to generate phantom power. If you put 48 volts up that cable, the likelihood is you're going to probably fry something in your synthesizer, which you don't want to do, so you put a DI box in between. The DI box protects your instrument from that phantom power. And protecting your desk from errant voltages from the keyboard. So going back the other way, the keyboard might be producing some errant voltages and you want to protect your desk from it. The number of keyboards I've opened up where the reduced earth hum, the previous owner has just disconnected the earth cable, means that the actual box has the likelihood of being hot. And if that's the scenario where you don't have a fixed earthing point within the actual synthesizer itself, quite often the neutral or the shield can actually move up to a mains voltage, and that's really a bad idea. So there are a number of reasons why you might use a DI box, even if you weren't considering balanced or unbalanced. Personally, when I gig, I quite often will have DI boxes in my kit bag, and the reason for that is because I've got a lot of money invested in my synthesizers, and I don't want the venue or wherever I am to basically fry my synthesizer, especially as my legacy stuff is hard to replace. But in this instance, we're going to use the DI box for just converting the signal from the keyboard or the source into a balanced signal for transmission to the target. Of course, going down this route, we'll swap from an unbalanced line inputs to your mixer to balance probably mic inputs, because you're going to change the impedance. But it's always a good way, because that way you are protecting yourself, you are transmitting over the distance, which is going to be balanced, and it will reduce the amount of noise that you have on that signal, putting into the mixing desk and ultimately into the PA. I said going balance costs you money. So not only are the cables more expensive because you've got more copper, as in there is another cable in that, and obviously the terminations have 3 points at each end. So that's the first thing. It's going to cost you more for your cables. The second thing is that you're going to have to invest in some DI boxes. Now, I have to be brutally honest, you don't need to spend the earth on a DI box. I mean, you can spend quite easily several $100s on a DI box. But if you do spend that sort of money on a DI box, you are going to the top end of the market. You can get fairly reasonable DI boxes for about $20. And to be honest, they will do the trick. They are passive, they're not powered. You can move up to powered DI boxes, which use phantom power from the desk. Again, that's another way of doing it, or they actually have some sort of power supply you need to supply into them. Personally, the simple passive ones that are going to cost you about $30 will probably be fine for what you want them to do. But obviously you have to look at the instrument that you're actually trying to create a balanced signal for, and you have to look at where your target is, and sometimes you need to go to a more expensive DI box that has slightly more features on it to give you the right match between the two. Definitely a box that will cost you a couple of $100 will be able to match in with most infrastructure in terms of desks and PAs, etc., because it will have a lot more features on it, and it will probably be powered in some way. But hopefully that is enough to give you an insight into the balanced or unbalanced question that you may need to ask. Until next time, goodbye. If you liked the content of the video you've just seen, please give it a thumbs up. It just helps the YouTube algorithm with its selection process. If you want to leave a comment, please feel free to do that as well. Down below somewhere should be the ability to do that. I do try to respond to all the comments that are raised on the channel. Sometimes it takes me a few weeks because of what I'm doing, and I'm getting more and more and more comments and questions raised on the channel, so it just takes sometimes a little bit of time to do a bit of research. If you want to be notified when I put more rants, mailbergs, and videos about this sort of legacy tech and even modern tech on the channel, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell icon, and you'll be notified by YouTube when stuff happens. I try to publish at least 2 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. Until next time, bye-bye.